hello everyone, I am Eshaan Agarwal from Software Development Group Corps IITBHU. In the previous lesson, we learned how to work with HTML forms in Django, and in particular, the easiest way to write forms to create and update and delete model instances. In today's lesson, we'll talk about testing our Django application. Now, our local library is almost complete with all the features, and we can see different list of books, even renew our subscribed book copy and check our list of borrowed books. But it is evident that our site is quite simple and it implements limited features. Even with this relatively small site, manually navigating to each page and superficially checking that everything works as expected, it can take a lot of time. And as the complexity of the site will increase, the time required to manually check that everything works properly will only grow. And if we were to continue as we are, eventually we'd be spending most of our time testing and little coding. So what is the solution here? The solution is automated tests. Automated tests have a lot of benefits. The obvious benefits that we can see are that since they are automated, they can run much faster than the manual tests. Second, they can test to a much lower level of detail. That means that we could efficiently check a small functionality of code which can be of class or of function level. Third, they can test the same functionality every time. That means they are more reliable than the human testers. Because they are fast, automated tests can be executed more regularly, and if a test fails, they point to exactly where the code is not performing as expected. Now, after taking a look at what automated tests are, now let's take a look at the types of automated tests. So there are numerous types, and we'll take a look at the most important ones. So the most important ones are unit tests, regression tests, and integration tests. Unit tests are used to verify functional behaviors of individual components, which are often class or function level. That means that we use unit tests to check whether a particular small implementation is working or not, and these components can be of class or function level. Second is regression test. Regression test is used to reproduce historic bugs. Test is initially run to verify whether the bug has been fixed, and then it is rerun to ensure that it has not been reintroduced following later changes of the code. So as you can understand from the statement, they are used for historic bugs, and we can use regression tests to check whether the historic bugs are getting reproduced or not. Third is integration tests. So they helps us in understanding how the grouping of components work when they are together. So as I told you, as the complexity of the site increases, there are going to be multiple level of components that are going to interact with each other. So integration test helps us in understanding how the components are interacting with each other, and are they interacting in the way that we want or not. Now let's take a look at what does Django. Now, as we can see, testing a website is a complex task, and it has a lot of things which are involved. It can involve model querying to form validation to even template rendering. So what does Django provide us for testing them? Django provides a test framework with small hierarchy of classes that are built on the Python standard unit test library. Despite the name, which is unit test, we can use this library to write both unit and integration tests. And apart from that, Django also provides us API methods and tools to test web and Django specific behaviors. That is that we can also simulate requests and insert dummy test data and inspect our application's output. Also, you can also use different frameworks to test your application using Selenium. Now let's take a look at the format of writing a basic test. So to write a test, you derive it from any of the Django's unit test base class, for example, simple test case, and then you write separate methods to check that the specific functionality works as expected or not. Now, the best base class for most of the tests that we are going to use it's going to be the Django test case class. This test class can help us create a clean database before all the tests are run, and also runs every test function in its own transaction. That means that the next test is only going to run after the first one is completed. The class also owns a test client. This test client helps us in simulating as to how a user interacts with the code at the view level. And In the later part of the video, we are going to focus more on unit tests created using the test case base class. So before we move into that, let's take a look at the code snippet that's here. So as you can see, there are two functions which are setup and tear down, and the whole class is derived from the base Django unit test class, which is test case here. So the setup function, this function is used to run setup and insert dummy data before all the test methods are run. And tear down function, as you can understand, this helps us in cleaning them after a particular test method is performed. And apart from that, for example, we have provided here two dummy test functions. So the test something that will pass function asserts whether a condition is false or not, and similarly the test something that will fail function, this function is asserting whether some condition that we have passed, whether it will return true or not. So after taking a look at the format of writing test, now after taking a look at how the test class is written and how we can write a test, let's take a look at what should you test. So you should test all aspects of your own code and your own logic, but not any library or functionality that is provided as inbuilt a part of your Python or Django. So for example, let's consider the book model. So let me quickly show you the code so we can understand this in a better way. So we move into the models, and here we can see the book model, and it has different fields which are title, author, genre, description, maximum retail price, and rating. So as you can understand, you don't need to explicitly test the title or author or any kind of field that has been stored properly with the type of field that is, for example, for title and author, that is char field, because that is something that is done inherently by Django, and we can trust that the Django is doing it right in a right manner. However, you should check the text used for the labels, that is the title, author, genre here, and the size of the field. So as you can see, we have set the maximum character limit for title, author, and genre to be 100 characters. So these are part of our code. These are part of our logic. So these are as they are part of our design, they could be changed and they could be broken. So these are some functionalities that we can test. Similarly, you can see there are two functions which are present in the book, which are the str and get absolute URL. So similarly, you should check that custom methods get absolute URL and str behave as required, because as I already mentioned, they are part of our business logic. And in this case, if we talk about get absolute URL, here we use the reverse function of the Django. So we can trust that as this is the part of Django, this will be implemented properly. So what you are actually testing is the view which is associated with what has been defined. With that in mind, let's start looking at how we can define and run tests. So before we move to that, let's see the file structure that could be there for writing efficient and modular tests. So Django, Django uses the unit test module. So unit test module has a feature which is the built-in test discovery. This means that it will discover any test under the current working directory, which will have the file name with the pattern test star.py. That means that if any file name has test and then the appropriate subpart of the name, then that could be identified as a test file, provided that you name the files appropriately. And as you can see here, I have made 3 test files, which are test form, test models, and test views. So how does the Django identify whether these files are test or not? Because they have the test word in the front of it. Now you can use any structure you like for making the test files and structuring them, but I recommend that you create a module for your test code. This helps us in scaling the test files as the complexity increases. So here, as you can see, I have made separate files for both models, views, and forms. And we can also write test files for any other type of code that you will implement. So here I have made a test directory, a separate folder, and in which we have the init.py and the 3 test files, which are test forms, test models, test views. And as the name suggests, in test forms we are going to implement all the tests related to forms. In test models we are going to implement all the tests related to all models, and similarly for views we are going to implement all the tests related to views. And the init.py, make sure that you keep this file as empty, and this tells that to Python that the package is a directory. Again, the structure of writing test for functionalities is very much up to you. You could have different classes for each functionality, or make a general class for the testing. That's up to you, but it should be best that if you are consistent with it. For example, let me show you the code here. I'll explain in the later part of video as to how the code is working. Now, as you can see here, let me quickly show you this in the test models file. So this is the file where we have implemented all the tests for our models. Let me quickly uncomment this. So here we have used class book model test, and we have derived it using the test case class from the unit test module. And there are numerous methods which are there, which are, as you can see, these are setup test data, test title label, test author label, etc. So there is one particular function where I would like to bring your notice. So this is the setup test data. Setup test data function is run at the beginning of the test run for a class level setup. You can use this to create objects that aren't going to be modified or changed in any of the test methods. So as you can see here, we have created a book object, and it has the title Rich Dad Poor Dad, and the author is Robert Kiyosaki. Similarly, we could also use a function which is called setup data. It hasn't been implemented here, but you can understand that the setup method can be called before every test, so that we could pass fresh version of these objects. Apart from that, there are some conditions which are also provided here. So you must be wondering what this assert equal, assert equal are, assert equal, assert true, and assert false are. So there are a number of test methods, and these test methods use assert functions to test whether the conditions are true, false, or equal. So these methods are assert true, assert false, and assert equal. As the name suggests, if a condition is true, then it will the assert true is used to assert whether the condition is true, and we can use assert false to check whether the past condition is false or not. And as shown here in the code, the assert equal is used to check whether the two fields that we have provided, whether they are equal or not. And if the condition does not evaluate as expected, then the test will fail and report the error to your console. And the assert true, assert false, and assert equal are standard assertions provided by unit tests. Now let's see how we can run all the tests. So the easiest way to run all the tests is to use the following command. The command is python3 manage.py test. So let me quickly show you how the command is done. So I have written the command. It is python manage.py test, and let me enter this. In order to show you how the tests are working, I have uncommented the part of the models, all the tests which are related to models. For the time being, we do not need to understand what these tests are, and let me quickly enter the command so that we can see what does the output come. So okay, all the tests we have run all the tests, and as you can see in the output, first we found all the 5 tests, and then using the setup test data we created the test objects which were of the type book model. So it had the title Rich Dad Poor Dad and the author Robert Kiyosaki. And then the command ran all the tests, and since there were no issues in the code, so it showed okay, and that means that all the tests ran successfully. Okay, apart from that, if you need to show more information, that is, we need to understand what actually happened in each test case, we can use a flag which is verbosity. So let me quickly show you how this is done. So I have the command here. Let me quickly add the flag which is verbosity, so it has the spelling VERBOS, verbosity. Now it has various modes, so we can set 0, 1, 2, 3 depending on how much information we want for our all the tests which we are going to run. So let's just say, for example, I write it 2. Let me quickly run this and see what happens. So as you can see, this time we got a more detailed view of what all happened when we ran the test. So it tells us all the operations that it had to perform, then what it did, and then it ran all the migrations. And after this, I tried to test all the tried to run all the tests, that is the test title label, test author label, etc. And these all tests returned okay. So finally we got a final okay. That means all the tests ran successfully. Also, if you want you to run specific tests, you can run a subset of your test by specifying the full dot path of the package or the module or the test case subclass or method. Now we know how to run our test and what sort of things we need to test. Let's take a look at some of examples of testing things in our local Django application code. So let's dive in. So first, we are going to take a look at all the tests which are related to models. For testing of models, I'm going to demonstrate how we can write tests by using the book model. So let me quickly show you the book model. So this is the book model. It had the following fields, which were title, author, genre, description, maximum rating, and maximum retail price, and the ratings. And they were of various types. And now we are going to try implement tests for this model. So before that, we have done all the necessary things. We have imported the test case base class from the Django test unit test framework. Then we have imported the book model, which is needed because we are going to create objects and we are going to test the functionalities of the book model. Now, as a standard practice, we derived the book model test class and we derived it from the standard test case class, and it has the following functions. As you can see, as you can understand from the name, setup test data. This is used to set up the non-modified objects which are going to be used for all the tests, and helps us in setting up the class-wise setup. So here we have created a book object which has the title Rich Dad Poor Dad and the author is Robert Kiyosaki. Then we have a numerous test functions. So the first one is test title label function. This function is used to test whether the title label is correct or not. Similarly, we have the test author label function. This is used to check whether the label is correct or not. So the field test check whether the values of the field label, which is the verbose name, and size character are as expected or not. So here you can see we have implemented a test which is the test genre max length. So as we already know, for genre we have set the maximum length to be 100, so that a genre should be cannot be more than 100 characters. So here we are going to implement a test to check whether the condition is satisfying or not. So here we have implemented the test genre max length. First we fetch the book object using the first ID, and then from the meta get field we fetch the max length, and then we try to assert whether the max length is equal to 100 or not. So here, as you can see, we have used the self assert equal function. So assert equal function is used to assert whether two things that we have provided are equal or not. So if the max length which we got from the book object, if it was 100, this will return true. Otherwise, we will get an error on our console. Similarly, we have two other functions which are test object name is title by author and test get absolute URL. So the second last function is used to check whether the str function which is present in the book model, whether it's working correctly or not. Similarly, we have the test get absolute URL function, and this is used to check whether the URL which we are getting for the book instance, whether it is correct or not. So now we know how to test, how to implement tests for our models. So now let's move on to forms. The philosophy for testing your forms is same as that of model. You need to test anything that you have coded or that is design specific, but not the behavior of your underlying framework and the other third-party libraries. Generally, this would mean that you should test the forms that have fields that you want, and that whether they have the appropriate labels and the help text which you need. You don't need to verify whether the Django validates the field type correctly unless you have created your own custom field or validation. That is, you don't need to test whether a email field will only accept emails. You can trust that the Django will do it properly. However, you would need to test any additional validation that you expect to be performed on the fields. Now, in order to understand it in a better way, we consider a form for renewing books. So let me quickly show you the code for our form. So we have the form which is the renew book form. It has a field which is the only field which is renewal date, and using the test we are going to verify whether it has the correct label in the help text or not. Apart from that, we have the clean renewal date function. So we provide a date which is the renewal date to it, and it does some kind of checks. So the first check is that it checks whether the date is in past or not, and the second check is whether the date is in the allowed range, which is 4 weeks from today or not. So using our test, we are going to check whether the conditions are working or not. So let's move on to testing. So we have written the code. Let me go through the code one by one and explain you how it is working. So first, since we are dealing with date times a lot, we have imported datetime, which is a necessary module. Apart from that, we have imported test case based class from Django test, and we have used this to derive and create a new renew book form test class. Since we are also going to use the renew book form, we have imported it from the catalog.forms. Now we have numerous functions, and we are going to go through them one by one and check how and what kind of tests are implemented in each one of them. So the first one is related to field label. So in this function, we try to check whether the field label for renewal date is provided or not. If it is none, then the condition will return true, or if the form field has the label renewal date, then only the condition will return true. Similarly, we have the second function, which is the help, which is related to help text. So here, using the assert equal, we check whether the help text that is present in the form is exactly as same as the one that we want, which is enter a date between now and 4 weeks. Similarly, we have other functions. So one of them is test renew form date in past. Here what we do is that we set up a dummy date which is in past using the datetime module. Then we provide this date in a form, and we check whether the form is valid or not. So if the form is implemented properly, the form should return false. So using assert false, we are trying to capture that, and if the condition returns true, it will show us error. Similarly, we have implemented function to check whether the date is too far in the future or not, or whether it and similarly whether the date is today or not. So you can see from the code, using assert false and assert true, we have checked whether the form is valid, and if it satisfies the condition that we want, then the test has run successfully, and we'll move on to further tests. Otherwise, it will show error on our console. Finally, we have understood how we can implement tests for forms. So now we'll move to views. In views, to validate our view behavior, we use the Django test client. This class acts like a dummy web browser, and we can use it to simulate get, post, request on a URL, and even observe the response. We can see almost everything about the response, from low level HTTP to the template that we are using to render the HTML, and even the context data that we are passing to it. We can also see the chain of redirects which happen, if any, and also check that the URL and the status code which is there at each step. This allows us to verify that each view is doing what it is expected or not. So let's start with one of the simplest view, which provide us the list of all the books. So let me quickly show you the views which are there. So let's go to views.py. So here we have the book list view. So book list view is using the model book, and it has the field paginate by, which means that it is going to display 3 books at max at each page. So now we are going to implement all the functions, all the tests that we need for this view. So all the test uses the client which belongs to our test case derived class. Let me quickly move to test views and let me comment it. Okay, so similarly, as we have done in all the other test files, we have imported necessary things. So since we are using the test case function, as it has the client, we have imported that. As also, since we are using the reverse function, so we have imported that. And apart from that, since the book list view also going to need the book model, so we have imported that from catalog.models. So all the tests uses the client which belongs to our test case derived class, and we'll use that to simulate a get request and get a response. So the first function which is here is that we check whether we get the specific URL that we need. So how do we do that? For that, we first try to using client, we try to get the response on the specific URL which is /.catalog/book. The thing to note here is that this is this specific path is without the domain, and then we get the response, and using the assert equal function we try to check whether the status code which is present in the response is 200 or not, where 200 means that it was successful. Similarly, in the second function, we have test view URL access by name. Here we try to generate the URL from the name in the URL configuration. So once we have the response, we query it for the status code and the template used, or whether or not the response is paginated. These are some of the fields that are present in the response. And the most interesting variable that we have here is response.context. The response.context helps us understand and see all the context variables which are passed to the template by the view, and this is incredibly useful for testing because it allows us to confirm that our template is getting all the data that it needs. So let me show you how the further tests are going. So the third test is test view uses correct template. So here we first try to get the response from the book name, then we assert whether we got this status code as 200 or not. Secondly, we also assert that whether the template which we have used, whether the URL of the template is catalog/book_list.html or not. Third is test pagination is 3. So as you can see in views.py, we have set the paginate by to 3. That means at most 3 books would be displayed in each page. So we are going to check whether it is happening or not. So we are going to implement a test for it. So let's see here. As you can see, we have first fetched the response using client for the book name. Then we try to assert whether we got status code 200 or not. If we got the status as 200, we'll check whether we have the is paginated field in the response.context. If the response.context has the is paginated field, that means we'll further check whether the is paginated field is true or not. If is paginated field is true or not, we are checking this using the assert true function. If it is true, that means that the list view has passed, that the books are going to be shown in a paginated manner. Then we are going to check using the response.context in book list whether the paginate by, which is the 3, that means at most we could display 3 books in a page, whether it's 3 or not. So using assert equal, we are going to assert this and we are going to check. So if the condition is true, we'll move on to further tests, otherwise it will show error. Similarly, we have another function which is test list of all books. So before we move on to that, let me show you this. So before we run all the tests, we use the setup test data class, and we use this to set up data for our class wide all the tests. So first we set the number of books to 5. So we are creating 5 books for our pagination test. So if we created 5 books for our pagination test, the first page will have 3 books and the second page will have 2 books. Since we have said that uh, since we have set the paginate by to 3, now we create dummy objects for each book, and we using the book ID with title Art of Making Money and the book ID and author as Ronald. So this part is irrelevant. So let's move on to the test list all books. So here similarly for each, here what we do is, since that we have the total books as 5, so the second page should show the remaining 2 items. So we first fetch the response from self.client for the books, and with the query that the page should be 2. Then we check whether the status code was 200 or not. If the status code was 200, we check whether the paginated field was present in response.context. Similarly, we check whether the is paginated through is true or not. If is paginated is true, we check the in response.context whether the book list is true, which it should be. If it returns true using the assert equal function, that means that this test case has passed and the paginate by is working correctly. Sometimes we need to test views that are restricted to logged in users. In some cases, you'll want to test a view that is restricted to just logged in users. For example, our loaned book by user list view. So here is the loaned book by user list view. So in this view is very similar to our previous view, which was the book list view, but is only available to logged in users and only displays book copy records that are borrowed by the current users and have the on loan status and are ordered oldest first. So let's see how we can implement test for this. Okay, so we have imported the requirements here, and we have set up the class loan book by instances by user list view test using the test case class. Now first we create a setup function which is used to create some user login accounts and book copy objects along with the associated books and other records that will use later in the test. Half of each of the books are borrowed by each test users, but we have initially set the status of all the books to maintainers. So as you can see in this part of the code, we first create 2 users and we save them. Then in the next here we try to create a book with the title, book title, and author, test author, and genre horror. Then using test underscore book dot save, we save the book object. Now we have set the number of book copies to 30, and since I have already told you, we have half of the books are borrowed by each test user, and we have initially set the status of all the books to maintenance. So here in this code in the for loop, what we do is that for each book copy we give it to a single borrower. We give half of the copies to borrower and set its status to maintenance. Now to verify that the view will be redirected to a login page, if the user is not logged in, we use the assert redirect, which is demonstrated in the test redirect if not logged in function. So in test redirect if not logged in function, we first try to fetch my borrowed from the fetch my borrowed, so we get a response. Now if the user is not logged in, it should ideally redirect to login page, and using assert direct we check that. Similarly, to verify that the page is displayed to logged in user or not, we first logged in our test user and then access the page again and check that we get a status code of 200. So as you can see here, first we have logged in our users, so we got the response when we tried to log in a user using self.client.login. Then if we check if the user is logged in or not using assert equal condition. Here we first try to get the user field in response.context. If the condition is true, then we move further. We check whether we got a response as success or not. That means that we were able to successfully go to the go past the login page or not. So assert equal will check whether we got the response.status code as 200. After this, we are going to check whether the correct page is displayed or not. So using the assert template use, we check whether the template that is being displayed, whether it is correct or not. and using the status code, which will be 100, will check whether we can verify that the user, if he is logged in, he is being showed the correct page. The rest of the test also verify that a view only returns books that are on loan to the current borrower. So in the rest of the cases like this, test only borrowed books in this, using the client and various assert functions. We check whether the books that are displayed in the list are only borrowed to the given user or not. Now, testing views with form. So testing view with form is a little more complicated than in the cases above, because you need to test more code parts. The good news is that views client for testing in almost exactly the same way as we did it for display only views. To demonstrate this, let's write some tests for the view used to renew books. So before we write tests, let's see the view used to renew books, which is renew book librarian. So here we need to test that the view is only available to users who have the ken mark return permission, and the users will be directed to an HTTP 400 error page if they attempt to renew a book copy that does not exist. So let's create tests for them. So first, in order to use permissions and check whether a permission is granted or not, we have imported permissions from the Django contrib.auth.model. Now using the setup function, we create users. So here we create 2 users and 2 book copies, but only give one user the required permission to access the view. So here in this test, we'll check using the different functions. For example, the test redirect if not logged in function. This will check if the person is not logged in, it will redirect it to the login page. Otherwise, if the person is logged in and if the user does not have the correct permission, using the following function will check whether the correct page is returned or not, and we will do this using by getting the response, and we'll assert the response.status code to 403. Similarly, in the next function, which is test logged in with permission borrowed book, we test it with a user who has the permission to check the access the view, and then we check whether we get the 200 response or not using assert equal. And similarly, we have implemented rest of the functions to check whether we get a HTTP 40400 page, like in the test HTTP 404 for invalid book when the book copy does not exist, and also a test to check whether the correct template is displayed for a given user or not. So that's it. That's all for testing a Django application. In this tutorial, I have shown you how to write tests and run tests for your model, forms and views. Most importantly, I have provided a brief summary of what you should test, which is often the hardest thing to work out when you're getting started. With what you have learned today, you should be able to create effective unit tests for your websites. So if you liked the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.